Well, greetings and welcome to One World in a New World. It's a new rendition of a show that I did back in the early 90s about how we can all learn to work together better. And now that I'm 30 plus years older, and I think many others are kind of in the same place I am. So I'm reaching out to a lot of really in tune, very present and knowledgeable people who have been doing the work along these years. And we're going to be inquiring about how they got where they were at, what they found, and how that can be helpful to the rest of us. All right. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Gilman to the show. Robert started out as an astrophysicist and then thought, maybe better that turned towards the planet instead of the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a valiant idea. He's had a really interesting background with sustainability as an elected official for a short time, and that he's kind of a planetary midwife for helping to usher in a new age, and which we're right at the cusp of now. So Robert, I appreciate your coming to the show, and thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, well, happy to be here.
Well, let's just jump right in. You've got this, it's Context Institute.
Right.
So let's start there. How did you develop that concept, and what were some of the things that piqued your curiosity and your inspiration in order to do so?
Yeah, well, Context Institute is 42 years old at this point. So going back to the late 70s, and I've been kind of pursuing community in the late 70s, and I won't go through the whole story, but wound up in Milwaukee, where David Spangler and Michael Matanovic and others of what are now known as the Lorien Association were doing evening classes, special classes. And we arrived just kind of at the end of the class, and the people in the class were saying, we like the philosophy, but we'd like something more grounded. And my wife and I had been spending quite a bit of time doing what we like to describe as living lightly. And so we decided that we would offer a course through the Extension Service on living lightly, which we did, and it was fine. But yeah.
The living lightly, could you kind of expound on what that really means?
Well, it was meant to be multi-level in the sense that part of it was a light environmental impact.
Okay.
But also it was, a sense of living with a light spirit, with a bright spirit.
Mm-hmm.
No particular spiritual orientation, more just generally.
It doesn't always need to be.
No, right. So out of that experience, it was clear that we had something to share that people were interested in, but I felt that, it's not my thing. It doesn't work for me to do a one-off and then move on to the next group and have the people who are in the group, that was fine. This is a little harsh, but it can wind up being middle-class entertainment.
Oh, yeah. And growth is continuous. It's not
right.
just, like you say, a one-off.
Right. So we felt we needed to do something that was embedded in community more. And we actually came back to where we were living in Washington State, and which was on the North Olympic Peninsula, just
Gorgeous
south.
Area.
Yeah, just south of Victoria and British Columbia. So we came back, and among other things, we had all these friends, some of whom were really into solar heating, some of them were into alternative health, some of them were into organic gardening, but they didn't see themselves as connected. We did. And we said, this is all part of living lightly. So we created the North Olympic Living Lightly Association. And that was actually how it all started.
So what I hear you saying is that you were able to, from an objective place and maybe at a distance, see all of these dots being connected and then work to figure out a way to actually do so.
Right. And
Okay.
it was largely a matter of supplying a container and a venue. And we had a little 6-page Xeroxed monthly newsletter put out on a Selectric typewriter. Boy, that was awful.
I remember those.
Right. So that's where we started. And then after a couple of years of doing that, the League of Women Voters started doing solar home tours, and we figured we'd already, it had been diffused into the surrounding culture.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we were getting more and more requests from further away for our little newsletter. First from other parts of Washington, then the West Coast and the U.S. and internationally. So we decided maybe this is time to go from a 6-page monthly to a 64-page quarterly.
Well, it's interesting to point out that how the flow began when you started small, and this was an organic thing that you didn't necessarily push. It was something that seemed to be ready to manifest, and this process just unfolded. You just happened to be at the right place, the right time to initiate it.
Right. But I do want to say, relative to the unfolding, that, I have my struggles when something gets going, and it's going along, and I have a kind of loyalty to it. So it took a little bit to get me to the place where I was ready to say, okay, we're ready to move on to the next phase.
Right.
So I don't want to, organic, yes, but I'm part of the organic, and
Sure. And we all change and grow and mutate and
right.
follow that growth pattern, whatever it may be, that we don't necessarily understand at the initial
Right.
engagement.
Yeah. It's so much easier to make a coherent story looking backwards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And in the process, it's like, you're in a river and you don't necessarily know where that river is going to go. All you know is that you're in it and you don't have to struggle. Right.
Well, you don't have to, but that doesn't mean that I didn't.
Right. Because we have fears. Now,
Right.
What kinds, speaking of, what kinds of things did you have to deal with internally, the fears that came up for you in this process? And some of those are probably going to be similar to others too.
Yeah. Well, it was, what we were doing was not like it was a big financial return. So we had our financial challenges, but I was able to learn that we would keep having this experience of coming to what I thought was the end of our rope, and then new rope would grow out of the end of it. So
one of the things that I've kind of noticed through this process for me, it did started early on for me with an NDE and some very interesting things that happened out of that, and then going into light, coming back with this understanding that basically we are cosmic consciousness condensed into form. Now, how do we recognize those patterns and evolve with them to where we experience some state of harmony, right? So in this process, there's this kind of reticence to like, okay, are we going to move forward? And then comes I call it this is one of the Trinity or Trinitized effects, the faith, love, and trust. Yeah. That oftentimes, we kind of doubt, and I think everybody doubts, whether they're going to be successful or this is going to be able to be accomplished and things like that. But we step into it, we lean into that, not knowing where it's going to go, and then finding out that rope does extend almost on cue, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. The universe is happy to deliver resources exactly when you need them, and of course, as a human being, I want to know that they're there before I need them. So so that's certainly part of the issue. Another piece was that I've always approached things in a in a kind of systems way and seen the multiplicity of pieces. And you probably know the story of the blind men and the elephant.
Mm.
And so I think one of the struggles is that I would be offering up this elephant to people, and they would grab onto a part of it and say, oh, well, thank you for offering me this trunk. And I say, no, it's just part of the elephant.
Well, and that's the thing I think that it is most challenging, is that because of all of these multiple perspectives, there's this circular view, and everybody's got a piece of it. And how then do you create the spokes and then the hub that they can all see themselves in, right? And that seems to be kind of what you're in process of.
Right.
Cool. So in this process, and I think you already mentioned this, that your learning was that, yeah, there is this faith, love, and trust that comes over time once these kinds of events have repeated themselves enough to where you get to the end of the rope, and then suddenly the rope extends. And so there's this ultimate trust that when you get into those places, something's going to happen. And I think part of what, especially now with this shift from the Great Reset to the Great Awakening, and I'll just put it encapsulated in that there's this understanding that, yeah, we've been taught to be afraid of each other, but are we really? And how can we extend it and find out that this trust now is there, and that we can all begin to look forward to a brighter future, and not necessarily one that's been so controlled, because like you said, we're looking at things in a systems way now. I mean, Cengate came out in the 90s with the corporate, push for systems thinking. And now there's this regenerative movement that includes a holistic picture that of body, mind, spirit, soul, and planet. Because that we all are conscious beings. Gaia principle's been around for how long? Right? And how have we tuned into that capacity that we have of being sensitive, right? To stop our, stinking thinking and just pause for a moment and ask a question and listen. So how do you see this process being brought into local environments and benefiting the future growth of more compatible communities and more even holistic communities?
Yeah, well, I've traveled a fair journey since back in the 70s. So at this point, my sense is that the kind of the key issues really have to do with such things as our largely unaware monopoly of categorical thinking, which is really embedded in the way that we use language, and also the degree to which everybody carries trauma of one sort or another. It's really difficult to get out of childhood without some trauma, and I'm a parent. It's not blaming parents, but the culture really has been clueless about how to deal with all that. So the places where I see the deep leverage points, if you will, have to do with our getting a deeper self-understanding, learning what we can do to deal with what I like to think of as the common garden variety traumas that just about everybody carries, and that are so common that we just treat them as if they were human nature, without realizing that they're a slice of the human possible, but there's a lot of other territory that's also the human possible. And so this is one of the things that's been a wonderful discovery for me has been the work of Stephen Porges, and in terms of the, how do I say this? I mean, he's a scientist and he talks about it as the polyvagal theory, but it's going to go over the heads of many people because it's not familiar language. But it really is the recognition of how central safety is in terms of the way that we respond to life. And that we have a very ancient threat detection system in us, amygdala, all of that stuff, that whose job it was and still is to protect us from really immediate physical danger.
Mm-hmm.
But we humans have repurposed it because our imaginations are so good, so that we imagine all kinds of things that then activate our threat detection system. So we're going into fight, flight, and all of this stuff on the basis of our imaginations about things that are not here now.
Right. And now, do you also find that I have a dear friend that's an Aikido instructor and was president of the Association for Alternate Dispute Resolution in America. He's kind of said there really is no conflict. There's just miscommunication. We each come to the table with a different dictionary and are triggered by the words in those dictionaries because we don't understand what the other person actually means with the words that they use. And it sounds like this is kind of a similar thing because this is how we react to people when we feel threatened. And it's usually not necessarily, body language is probably part of it, but the words, I think, are what begin that. And rather than having this active learning or active listening process, right, that's kind of a panacea, if you will, for engaging and overcoming fears between individuals, that this is it seems like this is a similar path and what you're and pattern of what you're saying exists.
Yeah, well, to some extent.
Okay.
But my sense is that we emerge out of childhood in various ways with places where we have sore spots, emotional landmines of one sort or another.
Right.
We also have certain limiting beliefs, which is the more cognitive side, and we have places where we have missing skills. And so it's important to be able to deal with all of that, and listening can be one of those missing skills. And I would agree that we get triggered by each other. And once you're in a place where you have two people who are both triggered interacting with each other, it's hard. It's hard to get something.
Insecurities just exponentiate from that place.
Right.
They're exacerbated in that process where people don't understand each other.
Right. And so this is where one of the things that we work with is what I call your optimal zone, which is the place where you are not in defense, where you feel safe in the moment, and so are not acting out of your defenses. And when you're in that place, then what emerges naturally from you is love and creativity.
I would totally agree with that. Even from a neutral place, if you're just recognizing that there are no threats around you, you look around, you hear something, and it's like, no, I'm okay. Why am I thinking these thoughts that say that I'm not okay when everything around me and the person in front of me is indicating that everything's just fine?
Right. Yeah.
So do you find that we often will create something that doesn't exist when we're in that place?
You mean if you're in the defensive place? Yeah, if you're in the defensive place, you're very much looking at the present through experiences in the past. So that and in some ways you almost emotionally you've shifted into the past. And so, yes, you create things that don't exist.
So how are you seeing the results of the efforts that you've had over the last few decades? What kind of changes do you notice in the people that you've touched and in the world in general as far as addressing these kinds of things and
Yeah,
what
yeah,
is possible and the reality of what's happening today?
yeah. Well, so there, again, back to the complex elephant.
Okay.
The one of the places where I think people have responded well to what I've offered has to do with the way that I understand the flow of cultural history, and that we're we're in this time of deep transition that's been going on for hundreds of years. It's not like it's this decade, uh, but when you understand that transition better, that it makes it easier to align yourself with a positive momentum, and
Sure.
in terms of what the changes are. And one of the big remaining one, if you will, we've already transitioned a lot out of where things were 500 years ago.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
um, but the big remaining one is we still have the belief that the way to organize things is in dominance hierarchies. Um, and that's become less and less of the reality on the ground. Um, but people still orient that way,
Right.
either
It's
because,
interesting
you know,
that, go ahead. I'm sorry.
either because they say, yes, I want the dominance hierarchy, or they say, no, I need to resist the dominance hierarchy. And it's really not the game that's the fundamental game right now. The fundamental game isn't that stuff. The fundamental game is bringing in and innovating the new cultural patterns that will allow us to live harmony within, harmony with others, and harmony with nature. And just, I'll stick in one more thing and then give you some space. But for me, an important part of what shifted in the planet is that there was a time when harmony within, harmony with others, and harmony with nature was nice, but it was not smart. It wasn't the smart way to worldly success. You and I might think it was smart, but the world didn't think it was smart. Um, Instead, what the world thought was that the way to success was enforce the three dominations: the domination over self, the domination over others, and the domination over nature.
Well, we were told some years ago, and even I would say the majority of folks ascribe to what's been written in a book we call the Bible today, and
Right.
that there's this um, notion that we were given the earth and to have domination
Yeah.
over it,
Right.
right, or dominion, right?
Dominion. Right.
And we have completely misunderstood this word, and actually what I think was meant was stewardship.
Yeah. Right. Right. Which is a whole different story.
Absolutely.
But understand that the Bible is basically all of the major religions, whether it's Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism, all come out of the past 5,000 years. Not exactly 5,000 years, but that chunk of time,
Sure.
which culturally, the way that the basis of social organization in those agrarian empires was violence enforced, religiously sanctioned hierarchy everywhere. And so all the religious stuff is part and parcel of that. That doesn't mean that there isn't some really valuable spiritual signal in there, but
True.
there's an overlay. It was all expressed in the language and the understandings of those times.
Right. Now, in this epochal change we're in from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, this kind of fits in because there's multiple patterns, calendars.
Right.
There are sequences that we're in as far as even in the big picture of a planetary civilization evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and they go through certain stages, and Kardashev talks about the type 1, type 2, and type 3 civilizations, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not even close to a type 1 yet, However, we do have some inklings that, yeah, maybe that's a good place to go. We just don't necessarily know how. And so what you're offering and what you found in the things that you do
Mhm.
is a way
Yeah,
toward
it's
that. It may not
right.
be the way, but it's a way that works.
Yeah, and I would say it's a way worth exploring.
Sure.
And so, I say that in the, I mean, I've devoted my life to it. So it's um, it's a bridge from where we are, and that bridge does involve doing what one can to build the new, to create. I'm very much with Buckminster Fuller,
Hmm.
who used to say that the only way to change something is to make it obsolete.
Right.
And so
I
the
think
fat
Socrates did that too, didn't
he could very well have.
he? Yeah.
The So the faster we live into, the faster we embody the harmony within, harmony with others, and harmony with nature, the faster the change happens. Um,
Now that brings up a really good point, especially in the time that we're in coming out of COVID.
mhm,
Schwab wrote in his book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, a couple of questions I thought were really interesting. One personal was, can we be caring and compassionate toward each other coming out of COVID? Now, what COVID, what all the narrative has done, fallacious or not,
mhm.
has taught us to be afraid of each other. So how can we incorporate the precepts of what you're talking about into a new order of thinking for ourselves and coming out of that fearfulness of others?
Right. Well, it's I have to tune into that a moment because
Sure, that's a tough question.
I don't feel the fear. And
Okay,
so,
I don't particularly either, but
right.
with the people that are still wearing masks, even and
Mhm.
the
Right.
the forced vaccinations and all of these things, the restrictions are being put on people simply because it's being done.
Mhm.
There doesn't seem to be much science behind it, if any,
Mhm.
um, and that kind of gives this um, hesitation, almost like like you're letting out on a clutch, and you're not, it's jerking, and it's not fully engaged yet.
Right.
So how do you see that, or how might others be able to reflect on what's happening in front of them and see it in a different way?
Yeah. Well, I think of COVID the destroyer, COVID the illuminator, and COVID the accelerator.
I
Um,
like that.
you know,
I
and
think that there's that three again.
yeah, and so I mean, I think coming out, if we want to describe it that way, it's really important as you look at other people, as you connect with other people, to um, it's kind of like we've been hunkered down with a hurricane going on, and now the hurricane is passing,
Mhm.
and so you can look at other people not fearfully, but understanding that actually you have a new bond,
Right.
a new shared experience. Plus, we've discovered that all kinds of things that used to be said as, oh, that could never happen.
Right.
And so that actually opens us up to all kinds of possibilities of what could
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
Um,
If these things were possible, and like you say, the accelerator, there's been a lot of really good stuff happen.
yeah,
You and I talking here
right,
now is
right,
a result of that. There are
right.
many groups that meet online,
Mhm.
the virtual reality, and there's this, it seems like a magnet that's been created to bring folks like you and I together in
Mhm.
different ways to share what we've learned in a more global perspective rather than just local or even
Yeah,
regional.
right. Yeah, very much so. Um, that's in an important part of what I'm doing right now is what we call the Bright Future Network, and that we're close to 300 people in 30 countries, and All done with Zoom.
You know what?
Speaking of the wider world, there it is, right
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
It's the wider world. So digitally,
Right.
you know, this brings up another interesting thing with the development of consciousness and sensitivity and quantum physics and all of these things that I know you are aware of because you're a deeply sensitive man, and you pay attention to the ebb and flow of what's happening within you in relation to what's going on. Do you see that in some way, because we are tied into this electronic network, you know, we're kind of electronic. We've got an electromagnetic field that we generate. Our brain waves operate in electromagnetic frequencies. How do you see this kind of being a way for us to tune in and to recognize that, you know, what if we're looking for something and we have questions, what's in front of us to answer those?
Right. Yeah.
Do you see the electronic, or do you find that in your quests and online, for instance, that information shows up when you're not necessarily expecting it, but it answers a question you've been holding for a while?
I find some of that. I'm
Okay.
also enough of a researcher that I certainly delight.
You know where to find stuff already.
Yeah, I delight in that capacity. I also feel as though even though, like so many things in human life at this point, the whole the internet has its pluses and minuses, and it's places where we're still learning things, but nevertheless, it really has enabled the world to connect with itself. And it's for me, it's been a really important part of being able to move to a planetary consciousness, because it's not just having a planetary consciousness in the abstract. You're talking with people anywhere on the globe,
Right.
and that this is the more horizontal peer-to-peer communication happens, the harder it is to maintain these pyramidal structures. The pyramidal structures need to have people trapped in them. The more leaky they become, the more things change. So it's
and perhaps also that there's a way that these you know, it seems that there's hierarchies in nature as well, right? So we kind of need to respect that these pyramidal structures have all been man-made. Now, how do we, or can we, shift those pyramidal structures to something more organic and natural?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think relative to categorical thinking that we need to be careful of is what I like to call categorical reversal, where somebody has a bad experience with a hierarchy and therefore says all hierarchies are bad, and therefore we have to try to do everything flat. And as you say, nature doesn't work that way. It's the issue really isn't so much tree structures, hierarchies. The issue is the traumas that lead to the dominance mentality. Back to stewardship.
Right.
We all need to learn how to be stewards of whatever it is that's in our sphere of influence.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean control, you know, because we,
as
humans, goes back to that previous thing. You know, we think we have to dominate, we have to control everything around us so that everything's just fine. Right. And just the opposite really is what's bubbling up and emerging from a lot of folks in humanity right now in finding that flow. Even Csikszentmihalyi wrote, you know, the flow of the optimal experience, or the psychology of optimal experience. These there's the gamma waves in our brains that bring us into this state, into this zone where we're available, and our natural proclivities, not the ones that have been that we've been inducted to, right? Or we've acquiesced to for some time just
Right.
because we didn't know a better way. Well,
Mhm.
now there's a better way, and even quantum physics, I think to some degree, and this may be a little far-fetched, but it makes
Mhm.
sense to me, is that these relationships that are being magnetized online now are evidence of further aspects of quantum entanglement.
Mhm.
And we're not seeing that. We're still lost in the scientific experimentation of the photons that or electrons that are vibrating that similarly in different
Right.
locations. Well, if that's happening, let's just scale that up and look at what, on a larger scale with us. How
Mhm.
would that work? What
Mhm.
might we experience? And what results or possibilities might exist as a result of that?
Yeah.
And just being conscious of it.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
So what, and you've kind of hit it around this for a while, but what kind of world do you see evolving now? And what kind of evidence can you cite of how things are working better and maybe what else needs to change?
Yeah. Well, it's very much of a mixed story right now, but I think those of us who have computers to talk with each other, um, m most of us don't realize how much things have changed in the last even decades for
Mm.
large portions of the world. And the change that happened in the last 200 years is enormous. Um, so that 200 years ago, you had like 95% of the world's population at a next to starvation poverty level. And today it's more like 10%. Now we should, we need to move to the point where it's zero,
Right.
but um, but that in itself is a huge shift. And we've had a similar shift in the level of literacy. And
Mhm.
literacy is a really important start for people being able to uh, begin to gain a little more control over the narrative in their lives.
Critical
Um,
thinking,
yeah. Um,
logic, deductive logic, inductive logic, just those kinds of skill sets that um, haven't really been present, and yet now are, people are starting to ask questions or a little
right.
better questions.
Right. So things are possible now that simply weren't possible 100 years ago, um, and possible for humanity is what I want to say.
Mhm.
And we have this collective challenge, that we, given our current way of life, we are using more than the planet's capacity. We're in overshoot in that sense, given our current way of life. But it's not a technical problem. Technically, we know how to live within, um, you're talking about regenerative culture, et cetera. We know how to live within the limits of the earth. Uh, the and we're probably actually pretty close to uh, the top of population in terms of the world.
Mhm.
We are in essentially all places other than Africa at this point. A lot of the other regions are actually declining in population. Uh, so
Right,
we're
going from 6 to 8 down to 1.5 or 2 children.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Um, so the
I don't know where the half comes in, but
yeah, right. That's a miracle of modern science.
yeah.
Anyway, the so it's we do need to do the harmony with nature. We have a lot to accomplish at a very practical level in terms of harmony with nature. But my sense is that uh, you know, we aren't going to do that without more harmony with others, and that's going to be very much dependent upon harmony within. So, but the
Sure.
good news is that harmony within is progressing, as well as harmony with others, is progressing in many, many people at uh, a historically rapid clip. So I think that we're going to find in this decade of the 20s that there will be lots of things where the pundits and the journalists would say, well, we never saw that coming, or we could never have
You weren't
imagined.
paying attention.
Exactly. Uh, so I think that, you know, so I don't want to get too much into predicting, but I want to say that the underlying strategy is that the only way we're going to get to a bright future is by having people who who not only envision it, but work toward it.
Sure.
You know,
And conversations like this are I hope, at least adding to that momentum.
right, right.
So if you could give a personal insight or advice for something that a person could do on a daily basis, what would that be?
Yeah. So I'll actually offer you a very simple, but actually quite good exercise that to be done on a daily basis.
Awesome.
It's something that I call the neurological reset, and it has to do with calming the nervous system and activating the more relational and the more safety oriented part. And you could do it just with breathing, but we're going to add something extra to it.
Okay.
So the extra thing is to scrunch up your cheeks, not with your hands, but just wiggle your nose. And it looks funny, but when you're dealing with your body, it's not a matter of how it looks, it's how it feels.
Right.
And what you're doing is that we hold tension in our faces. And so as you scrunch up your cheeks and wiggle your nose, you're bringing blood flow in there and stimulating all those nerves that are important. It's one of the reasons that the smile is so important.
Mm-hmm.
So you do that, you kind of scrunch up your cheeks, and then you breathe in through your nose comfortably, and then you breathe out through your mouth, but a little more slowly than you breathe in through your nose. This is heart rate synchronization, coherence,
Okay.
activity. And it's how it feels. It's not how it looks. And if you want just a little extra on there, then you can cross your hands over your thymus or your heart. And so, you know, doing this here in our conversation is one thing. Yeah. Right. Now do it another time, but breathe in more slowly this time when you breathe in. So scrunch up your face again, and then breathe in really comfortably. And then out slowly. And then one more time. Slower still. How does
Huge
that
difference.
feel? How does that feel?
Huge difference.
Yeah. And so you've always got the equipment. It takes under 30 seconds. And if you just do this at various times during your day, but especially do it if you are feeling the least bit triggered, you know, like you're worried about something, or you're annoyed about something, or any of that stuff. This helps you to get back into what I would describe as your optimal zone.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I can sense that, because there's, well, and obviously you get more oxygen,
right,
you slow yourself down, you're consciously aware, or at least your intention is to relax and find your center. And so you're doing this little ritual that empowers that
right,
intention and attention,
yeah,
which makes your interactions much more pleasant and at least a little closer to being harmonic.
right,
Right.
yep. So
I love it.
in terms of something that, you know, it's anybody can do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's available all the time. And if more people were to do that, the energy on the planet would shift.
And whether they're doing that or something else, you know, this whole this shift that's taking place, it's going to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And the more conscious we can participate in it, with an awareness of the needs of being centered, not being
Right.
triggered,
Right.
and to be open and available for what is, to not just embrace us, but for us to embrace it. And this also increases that that trifecta of harmony.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's, my sense is that there may be some, how do I say this? I agree that what's coming, it's in the pipeline. There's a birth that's underway, and but we're called to be midwives. And so we will have an impact on the character of the birth, and on how much suffering is involved,
Right.
how much scarring, etc. And so where we really have agency is to reduce suffering, and reduce it first in ourselves, but by reducing it, the energy of suffering in ourselves,
Right.
being able to bring that out into the wider world.
And this is not an unnatural process.
No.
You know, the chaos to order is a natural process, and being the midwives to that diminishes the trauma
Right.
for it when we're more conscious and participated with others in that process.
Yeah.
And I just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and the ideas and the scope of how these things can affect the world in general and individually specifically.
Right. Yeah. It's I like to describe it as a fast track, a surprisingly nourishing fast track to a bright future for you and the world. It's, not separate at all. And you don't have to just focus on the world, and you don't have to just focus on yourself.
Absolutely. You know, there's an interesting thing, and I'm going to jump off the precipice and get a little off world here for just a minute. Not that we're off world already.
Right.
So there was a book that Wilbert Smith compiled, or memoirs of his work in Canada from years ago, 1950s. He was the director for project management, which was Canada's UFO investigation program. And it was sponsored by the Department of Transportation, so it was legitimate. So he had some conversations with what he called people from elsewhere. One of the things that they had said to him was that our understanding of time is incomplete. Time to them is a measurement of the change of entropy. So this goes to what you just said, where this time of transition can be truncated as we get closer to that state of harmony, because there's less entropy. So
I like that.
There's science behind it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, well, I thank you very much for your time, Robert, and I really appreciate the work that you do, and hopefully that this can share it with others to a point where it can help your organization grow as well. And I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Zen.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And I'll close with namaste. And also in Lak'ech, which is Mayan for I am another you.
Great.
Thanks for being with me today, Robert.
You bet.